We received an overwhelming response with over 165 people registering and 165 people from 23 countries, which clearly demonstrate that this is a very, very important topic. And we thank you all for making time to participate in this webinar. As you've seen from the poster, the introduction, also the details of the invite, the purpose of this conversation is really to discuss the role of international climate finance in greening public and private sector finance in Africa. And why is this an important conversation? So if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, this is a region with 1 billion people and contributes between 2 and 4% of total greenhouse gas emissions, yet is the home of about 15% of the global population. However, by 2050, it is projected that 1 in 4 human beings will be African. And of course, herein lies the challenge, because the challenge here is to facilitate low carbon, climate resilient development while ensuring that these efforts do not constrain or compromise socioeconomic development. So this is the whole conversation around a just transition. And of course, a key component of this conversation is climate finance. And not just climate finance, but also how do we channel this finance to ensure that the outcomes and the impacts have the desired outcome on the global climate question. So let me start by just breaking apart the format of this webinar. So we'll start with some opening remarks from Jean Bosco Iachu. He's the CEO of Access to Finance, or AFR. AFR, together with ODI and Climate Works Foundation, have been the partners that we've worked with closely to facilitate and enable this webinar. So I will give him a few minutes to make some opening remarks on behalf of the partners. And then after that, we shall have a panel discussion. We have 3 panelists. I personally am quite excited that we got these 3 panelists. These are experts in this conversation and in this space. They have hands-on experience, and I look forward to hearing their thoughts and opinions and also sharing in their experiences. Of course, the last session will be a question and answer session, and we welcome you participants to drop in your questions in the chat box, and we shall look at them as we go along. I'd also like to point out that the scope of this conversation, because obviously climate finance is a broad topic, the scope of this conversation will cover the Paris Agreement and climate finance with a focus on Article 2.1c and Article 9 of the agreement. And if you've never heard of Article 2.1c and Article 9, then you're in the right meeting, because we'll spend time to just explain what this means in the context of Paris Agreement and also in the context of Africa. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Jean Bosco Iachu to make the opening remarks. And even as it comes, I'd like to point out that we will be having this conversation on social media as well. So the hashtag is Climate Finance Africa, and also we are on YouTube Live. Jean Bosco, welcome.
Yes, so thank you very much, Morefu. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, I can hear you.
Good. Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, participants, depending on where you are located as you join us in this very important conversation. So a warm welcome to you all, and thanks for your attendance. As Morefu said, this is indeed a timely conversation that we are having to look at different financing of capital flows that are addressing climate adaptation and mitigation. So as he said, I'm Jean Bosco Iachu, and I work with Access to Finance Rwanda. So we've been here since 2010 promoting financial inclusion and financial sector development. And we are so excited and glad to be part of this conversation, really to once again discuss the change that is happening to our environment and how responsibly we should address any of those challenges that we are facing. I'm joined with the team of AFR. I see them as part of the attendees, and it's a pleasure being here all. So I really wanted to, start by thanking our partners. I think without whom we wouldn't have this conversation. EED Advisory, ODI, and Climate Works Foundation. We joined hands to co-organize this event, and I think that's really very important. But also, we have partnered in working on the Rwanda case study to look at how financial flows are happening towards mitigating climate risks. So mine will be brief, ready to share some key outcomes of the Rwanda case study and why it is necessary to have this discussion, not only at this level of Rwanda, but also really scaling it up to the broader African continent, because it's vital that we all progress together, because you can't limit the effects of climate change. And they reach even those that probably didn't have an action that triggered any of those adverse outcomes. So as you know, when countries pursue their development agenda of economic growth and poverty reduction, which are key really, some have high probability to unintentionally increase carbon emissions. And this creates an inconsistency somehow, or a paradox in the economic development journey. And this has been seen where you want to really to reduce poverty, you want to grow your economy, but in the meantime, you don't know that you are probably creating other risks to the humanity. And that calls for really increased awareness on climate risks and associated mitigations, adaptation approaches across Africa. So beyond that awareness, I believe there should be adequate mainstreaming of climate change adaptation and mitigation in key programs that we see in different countries to support economic growth and poverty reduction. And in this endeavor, I believe the financial sector can play a role by greening finance, ensuring that the financing that is there is greened, but also financing green projects that are there and would contribute to this mitigation. And this would help really ensure sustainable economic growth, but also resilience of our communities, and most importantly, the low-income people across Africa that in most cases, they don't have a variety of instruments to mitigate or adapt to risks that come from climate change. Now, back to the outcomes of the Rwanda consistency case study. And as most of you would know, Rwanda is well aligned to the aim of having net zero emission and climate resilience by 2050. And that commitment has been there even as part of the adoption of the 2018 Paris Rule Book that was clear. And this there's one step to make a commitment, but there's also another step that is needed to ensure that you measure and you track progress towards achieving the goals that you have signed as a country. And that is very critical, because when you look at the Paris Agreement, the goal under Article 2.1c is clear on financial flows and ensuring that they are supporting climate resilient development. So the independent global stock tech is developing a compendium of case studies to achieve this measurement objective. And we are so glad that Rwanda is among 3 countries across the globe that have already developed this case study. We recently developed it as partners here with involvement of different stakeholders that are here present. And I'm really proud that Rwanda, my country, is the first country in Africa to look at that aspect and ensuring that whatever we do is aligned to these goals. So in Rwanda, as I said, I mean, we are not out of the risks of climate change, and we have some sectors that are largest emitters of gas, and those are agriculture, energy, transport, and when you look at it from this study, we need close to 11 billion USD for the next, I would say, 8 years, up to 2030, really for adaptation and mitigation measures. And these can't be done without the private sector playing a very important role. So Rwanda is really a climate progressive country in Africa. And I believe probably that's why the choice was made on Rwanda to look at this first case study across Africa. And the government has really adequate policies. They are highlighted in this report. And those policy instruments and strategies, incentives are really supporting climate resilient development. And you know already there are some funds that, I mean, for NERWA, we have the National Agriculture Insurance Scheme. Really clear in the new investment code, you can see e-mobility has some incentives when you are investing in this space. So all those policy instruments, but also strategies and incentives, we believe will yield to a good outcome in the future. However, there's need to watch the energy, the petroleum or transport that is really utilizing petroleum mainly, and the agriculture sector's investments to ensure promotion of more clean energy, climate smart transportation and agriculture. So that's really very important to monitor as we develop. I think we don't want to go into that paradox where you are championing economic growth, yet probably some of the programs are creating emissions, and that's really something to be on the watch. This study also, I mean, shows the clear importance of a national policy around climate change, really to make sure that you fast track and jumpstart the alignment of financial flows with the third objective of the Paris Agreement. So that's really bringing the stakeholders together around that policy framework is very key. But also defining, and providing guidance on climate finance for mitigation and adaptation. I think different private player sectors, also public sector players, they need to understand what's the difference and what are the incentives that are aligned to each. So as we position Rwanda as a international financial center, I believe we have an opportunity for alignment of financial flows for climate resilient development. And this is something that we should do going forward. So I'll pause there and welcome you all once again and wish you a fruitful deliberation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, John Bosco. Thank you for that introduction. And for those who just joined us, I had mentioned earlier that you can join the conversation on social media. The hashtag is Climate Finance Africa. You can see it on the chat box. And also the report that John Bosco just mentioned is actually available online, and you can see the link which is provided on the chat box. So we'll go straight into the panel discussion. And like I said, I'm quite excited that we are having the privilege of interacting and discussing this with this set of panelists. And I'll start by A quick introduction, and then we'll go straight into the questions. So our first panelist is Teddy Mugabo. Teddy is the Chief Executive Officer of the Rwanda Green Fund, also known as FONERA. Part of her role includes guiding Rwanda towards realizing its ambitious climate action objectives. Prior to her appointment as CEO, she served as the head of business development at FONERA. Teddy has a postgraduate science degree in climate change and development from the University of Sussex in the UK. Teddy, welcome to this conversation. Next, we have Bianca Gishangi. Bianca is the coordinator of the East Africa Alliance on Carbon Markets and Climate Finance. She has extensive experience in carbon markets, including hands-on experience originating and developing some of the largest CDM projects in East Africa. Bianca holds a Master's of Science degree in Climate Change and Policy, also from the University of Sussex. In fact, I just noticed this when I was looking at the bio. So seems like there's something going on at the University of Sussex, which is interesting. Also, I should point out that Bianca used to be a colleague at EED Advisory, so it's good to have you back and good to have you on the panel, Bianca. Then next is Okechukwu Daniel Ogbonaya. Okechukwu is a country representative of the Global Green Growth Institute, GGGI, in Rwanda. He's an international development cooperation professional with a focus on climate change, adaptation and mitigation in developing countries, and has worked extensively with several governments towards mainstreaming green growth into national development plans. Okechukwu holds a master's degree in international development cooperation from Korea University. Okechukwu, again, thank you very much for making time to be with us. So we'll dive right into the questions, and bearing in mind that we have a very diverse pool of participants. We have, of course, climate change experts, but at the same time, we also have those who may not be familiar with the key concepts of climate change and are new to this conversation. So I'd like us to start by breaking down the title of this webinar. So the title is, how can climate finance support the greening of public and private finance in Africa? And a good place to start would be by defining what climate finance is and what are the most common sources and types of climate finance. So to break this down, I'd like to invite Bianca to just talk a bit about what climate finance is and what are the common sources and types of climate finance. Over to you, Bianca.
Apologies, it's having some trouble unmuting, but thank you very much, Miracle. And I think I'll just try and keep it as simple as possible. But first and foremost, I think I'd just like to say there's no one standard agreed upon definition of climate finance, but there is a general understanding, which is why we can have this discussion today. And really, it's finance that is directed towards activities that lower emissions and those that enhance resilience to climate change impacts. So, in a very simple way, finance channels toward funds which are channeled towards mitigation and adaptation activities in the climate space. So different institutions and financial institutions will have different meanings, but all around that same general understanding. And for sources, it's in the title, as you said, public and private, which can be domestic and which can be international. So when we think about international sources, we're looking at money that's coming from government budgets, but going into multilateral development banks, different financial institutions, but we also look at different mechanisms. So since we're talking about 2.1 and Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, we're looking at the financial mechanisms for the Paris Agreement, which is the GCF, and which is the Green Climate Fund, and the Global Environment Facility. So different types of funds also now where that money is put into become sources of this finance on a large scale. On a private sector side, we're looking at financing coming from private corporations, pension schemes, and this all can be put into, can be channeled as international finance into countries for different activities. Domestically, I think we have other examples that will come from Rwanda today, so we'll see more about that. But basically, you can have sources of revenue going into climate activities on a domestic level that can be collected from different ways through public institutions and through private sector investment. So in a nutshell, the different sources would be private and public going through these different financial institutions or mechanisms that have been created under the UNFCCC. Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Bianca. The next question on climate finance is always around how much, how big. And I'd like to direct the next question to Okechukwu. In October of last year, Nature, the peer-reviewed journal, published an article titled "The Broken 100 Billion Promise of Climate Change and How to Fix It." This was authored by Jocelyn Temperley. So the question I have for you is split into two. So first, do you agree with this characterization? And two, how is climate finance tracked? And what are the estimated annual flows to Africa?
Thank you, Murefo, and I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this webinar. I wouldn't say that I agree fully with that characterization, because when you look at the fact that, climate finance, when it comes to how much, is actually a controversial sort of question, or if I should say issue, for the fact that there hasn't been any standardized methodology globally to say this amount or this figure could be categorized as climate finance. We do know basically that different institutions or organizations are using different methodologies, when it comes to, tracking climate finance. That is your other part of the question. But it is important, to say that at the onset, these methodologies are very difficult to ascertain the right amount, since when you look at it from forecasting, it is different from the actual amount that is given. So for institutions that have the ability to track both what is forecasted or what is promised versus what is actually given, they could be closer to having some specific amount. But also, when we look at what is happening as climate finance evolves, you will realize that financing is linked to projects. So how do you define finance that is climate sensitive if that project is not green, quote unquote? But if I can say concretely, the OECD reports have shown some data that shows that Africa has received almost up to 25% of climate finance between 2016 to 2019, roughly around 18.5 billion USD, compared to Asia that have received even almost close to double that amount. The question will be, when you look at what is happening today, where some regions are even now tagging projects as climate finance that initially weren't seen as green projects, then you will start questioning if investments are going to those projects, then other regions might also follow that bandwagon. So OECD is one aspect or one area where you could see data that is a bit reliable, but also coming to the continent, we do have the African Development Bank, which also have its own process of tracking where money goes and could be tagged climate finance. So, like I said in the beginning, it depends on which country or which region you're talking to, and the kind of projects that these finance are pursuing for you to have an aggregate amount, that you can say this is the volume or the total that is put in place. So for Africa, yes, the climate finance tracking methodology used by the AFDB could be a good starting point to get these figures.
Thank you, Okechukwu. I'll continue this conversation directing it to you, Teddy. Okechukwu already mentioned and introduced the challenges of tracking climate finance. In your experience, could you add on to this conversation by outlining some of the other challenges that you have seen in tracking climate finance?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just making sure that the mic is on. So just adding to that, so tracking climate finance, I think Daniel really highlighted on this one. The issue has been, before we even talk about the tracking of the climate finance, is how do we differentiate, between traditional development finance and climate finance. So I think it actually starts from, even at the stage of mobilizing the funds when they come in. How do we really make sure that if there are funds that are not coming directly from the Green Climate Fund and maybe it's a project through another financial institutions, can we first make sure that we conduct this exercise to clearly articulate what is considered climate, what is that additionality? So maybe to address your question, the issue is also the criteria. I think not, it might be sort of for us, it's easy for us to understand because we're also in this sector. But when you look at several different institutions or different ministries, people, working in different sectors, they might not necessarily understand what we mean by climate. So I think there's a need for African nations or even just different countries to really say, how do we build understanding and capacity of climate financing? What sort of criteria should we put in place so that people understand that this money should be considered as climate? And then to now talk about tracking, just to give you an example, just recently, when Rwanda developed this, when we updated our NDCs and now we have an implementation framework, there's also an ongoing exercise that was carried out, whereby we're developing an MRV tracking system, which will be sitting in the Ministry of Finance and obviously working closely with FONERA, where we can now start tracking this money. Because what has, we've also had instances where some funds are actually going to support climate-related projects, but they're not being tracked because they've, it's basically a partner that has provided funding through the normal treasury. And then, so if the treasury doesn't necessarily understand what climate is, then it won't be tracked. So just to give you the solution, I think, is to have these MRV tracking systems that track the funding when it's coming and then even when it's being deployed.
So Teddy, you threw in an acronym there, MRV, which of course the industry experts know exactly what you're talking about, but could you break it down also for some of the non-technical participants?
Yes. So MRV is, let's say, I can even use monitoring and evaluation. How do we basically, it's a system. So you have this system which also, from the time the funds come, it's also able to monitor and track. So because I think when we talk about accessing climate financing, we also shouldn't look at it from the point of accessing it, but not utilizing it well. So having this MRV system not only tracks what has come in, but it's also able to monitor what happens on the ground. So it's basically a system, I would say, that helps us monitor and record, that will also be used to inform policy. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we also have, over the years, we learn from some of the, the different activities we're doing, or through the collection of this data, it might also inform policy later on that maybe we're not accessing enough funding to support our climate action plan. Maybe another thing that I believe that having these systems addresses is that you're able to know how much funding is going into what priority, for example. So if there's a lot of money that is being provided to the energy sector, then it can also inform governments or especially ministries of finance and say that, okay, maybe we should refocus some of the financing in another sector that is not accessing. So yeah, so basically, in a nutshell, that's what I would like to add. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we've broken down the first part of the title, which is what is climate finance? What are the volumes of climate finance? But there's a second bit on greening public and private finance in Africa. And I'd like to throw this question to Okechukwu. What is that? What is greening public and private finance?
Thank you, Mrefu. Well, just like we started, climate finance, are linked to climate projects. And when we use the term greening, it means to ensure that a project or program is pursuing a strong, inclusive, and sustainable growth. With public and private finance, this will mean, to mainstream environmental and climate change adaptation and mitigation principles into budgets, public budgets and expenditures. I think here in Rwanda, it is having the same name, environment and climate change budget statements. Other places, they use the word climate budget target. And for private sector, there is already a lot of talk on ESGs, that's the environment, social, and governance, where their main aim is not just within a short-term perspective, looking at making gains, but also looking at a longer-term risk and opportunities. And what this means will be that when you look at it from the environmental angle, you are looking at the physical risk within your business as a company or a corporation. You are looking at the impact of climate change to your business. When you look at the social aspects, you are talking of how does my business look into issues related to labor standards, issues related to human rights, workplace safety, and of course, governance is what we already know in terms of plugging or leakages in regards to accountability, corruption, or business ethics. So basically, when we say greening, we are looking at it from that broader aspect of making sure that the traditional way of budgeting is moved to where climate change adaptation and mitigation aspects are mainstreamed into budgets and expenditures within public sector, and within the private sector, they do the ESG and also think about the well-being and future of the next generation. Thank you.
Great. I think now we have a better understanding of climate finance and also greening public and private finance. So I'd like us to move it a notch higher and start zooming in on the key aspects of this conversation. So as I mentioned earlier, the scope of this discussion covers the Paris Agreement with a focus on Article 2.1c and Article 9. So I'd like to ask you, Teddy, to please explain, first of all, just broadly introduce the Paris Agreement and also what are these two articles, this Article 2.1 and Article 9. Over to you, Teddy.
Thank you. Just to, in a summarized way, if I can highlight, first of all, Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. So I believe, first of all, this agreement in enhancing the implementation of the convention. So this includes the objectives and aims to strengthen a global response to the threat of climate change. And maybe to focus on the one particular sort of subsection under this article is Article 2, 1C, where basically there's also, it's highlighted basically that we're supposed to making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development, and which again is tied into the conversation we're having today. We talk about this climate finance, but how do we ensure that the finance flows are consistent? Another, maybe going on to Article 9. Article 9 is pretty broad, but some of the key things that come out here is really looking at how developed country parties are expected to provide financial resources to assist developing country parties. So just to, as most of you followed, one of the conversations that has been going on for a very long time is really ensuring the ticket size, you know, the 100 billion that has been talked about over the years that hasn't been met. But there's also now a new conversation of also now that countries are revising or updating their NDCs. I believe there's also that need to cost, you know, to really have an updated sort of cost and budget to even see whether the 100 billion per year that has been, you know, been discussed over so many different COPs is actually sufficient. So here under this article, you look at that, basically the funding that's supposed to flow from developed countries to developing countries. Just trying to think something else that is important. Yeah, and then obviously as part of the global effort, whereby developed countries continue to take the lead in also mobilizing this climate finance. So that's, I don't know if I can't cover everything because there are many different sections, but what is important for the conversation we're having right now is one, you know, there's that sort of responsibility that, you know, through this convention of parties that developed countries are supposed to support the developing countries. Then comes the question of the ticket size. Is this really a valid number? Is it like evidence-based? And now that countries are revising NDCs, how do we make sure that these numbers are even revised? So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Teddy. Bianca, I wonder if you have anything to add to this question.
I think she's covered, at least in terms of the actual Paris Agreement. I think she's highlighted some key aspects, and the goal, that 100 billion, is often a really contentious issue because it's never met. You know, so it's one of those. It's one of those things that really might not be encouraging because we're now looking at discussing a new goal because this was for until 2020 and now we need one past that. And if we can't actually make 100 billion, it becomes very difficult to start, you know, asking. I believe like some figures thrown around were like 750 billion. Now it's a lot higher. So if we're not even making the 100 billion, how are we going to do this? But definitely there's an urgency and these pledges have to be met one way or another because it's really crucial that the finance is mobilized.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. Yeah, because as we all know, the 100 billion pledge first happened on us in COP15 in Copenhagen. And this has been a long time and it's been a long discussion. So we acknowledge this fact, and I think any conversation around climate finance has to think about what this means, right? And even in Africa, we have to think of what does this mean, even as we plan our development along the parts of low carbon development. What does it mean with this pledge, and also how should we think of it? Just to go back to Teddy. On Article 2.1, so there are obvious challenges in implementing Article 2.1 in Africa. So I'd just like you to mention some of these challenges from your experience, just to frame this opportunity and also challenge that is presented with Article 2.1c. But also as you do that, I'd like to ask you to just mention what should African countries understand ahead of the 2023 global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. And actually, now that I've asked the question, I think it's quite loaded. So there's the bit about the 2023 global stocktake, which I'd really appreciate if you introduce and break it down, because like I said, some of the participants may not be experts in this field. But the first bit is, as we think about Article 2.1c, what are some of the challenges that you have observed? Because once we start understanding and characterizing the challenges, then we can look at ways of addressing the same. So the first part is on the challenges, and then the second part is on the upcoming global stock tick and what African countries should understand in regards to this. Teddy?
Thank you, Ref. Those are quite heavy questions, but I'll do my level best to answer. So I think just to take on the first question you asked regarding challenges, so the various challenges in the journey, to growing a green public and private sector. And maybe before I talk about challenges, I would like to reframe it in a way that I think we basically start with what do we need to do as African countries? What should we have in place before we actually talk about the challenges that exist in accessing climate finance? And I think this is something that was highlighted in the opening remarks, that we need to have the enabling environment and the policy frameworks. I think just to give you an example or to reflect on what Rwanda has done, I think what has helped is that having a green growth and climate resilience strategy, which was very clear and sets a vision on how climate change needs to be mainstreamed across sectors. That really helped. It also led to the operationalization of a green fund. So I first wanted to highlight those two things because I believe that it's important for us as African nations to also position ourselves. Like, what do we need to take the question the other way around and say, what do we first need to have in place before we actually start these, these engagements as we try to mobilize the finance. Now, of course, another important entry point is NDCs. So I would very much encourage, countries, African countries, to all update their NDCs, because from just the interactions we've been having, or from COP26, this is basically the opening line. So if you have an updated NDC and an ambitious NDC, I believe this is also one way of even starting this conversation. So now, after all those once you have all that in place, there's obviously challenges, and I'm not going to shy away from those. I think the first challenge that we face is, yes, you can have all the strategies in place, you can have the policy framework, but the number one thing is we need to do an exercise of saying that, how do we clearly define the activities that can be taken up by the public sector, by public finance, and what can be taken up by the private sector. So I think, again, here I'm just talking from experience. We have an NDC that is costed, we have an implementation framework, but the next exercise is actually going to be one that we need to look at this NDC, look at the implementation framework, and be able to clearly articulate what needs to be taken up by what. Is it public, is it private, or PPP? Second challenge is developing a pipeline of bankable projects. So, because when you start talking about private finance or trying to attract private capital, and you start talking to the likes of DFIs and the EIB and AFT, the first question they ask you is, show us your pipeline. What kind of projects do you have? Are they bankable? So now that's another main challenge. And then, which is why it actually led to us, the government of Rwanda, basically decided to operationalize an investment facility which would cater for these issues of really how do we make sure that we position Rwanda to attract private finance beyond the grant funding that we've been mobilizing, but how do we also develop a good a pipeline of banking projects. So we're using a blended approach, whereby we're creating an investment facility that will have two windows, and one window will be a project preparatory facility that can support startups and feasibility studies, basically to help projects reach bankability. And once they're bankable, they can then be transferred to a credit facility that can access also different tailored financial products. So I would want to say that because of the different challenges that we faced, or the different challenges that exist within our market, we then try to create tailored financial products and financial instruments that can really cater for these challenges. So, and then one, of course, last one but not least is skill gap. So we still have to rely a lot on a lot of technical assistance and a lot of international experts, because this is a new area that is not really commonly understood by many different institutions. And it's not just the public sector, but also financial institutions when you look at commercial banks and development banks. So there's also a strong need to build skills and find ways to really come up with, I don't like calling them capacity building programs, because sometimes these are just typical trainings that don't really build capacity. But we need to be creative in a sense that how do we really build capacity of our local capacity, whether it's in the public sector, whether it's in the commercial banks, whether it's in all the whole ecosystem, so that we're really equipped and prepared to attract this financing. So I'll stop there.
All right. So I'll come back to you, Teddy, on the question on the 2023 global stock trade. But I'd like to ask Okechukwu one question in regard to what you said. So obviously, the question of readiness, right, is a question of readiness, just as Teddy has mentioned, is a big issue. So for African countries to access climate finance, there are several steps that needs to be taken. But on the flip side, there are some African countries that are wondering, should we institute all these processes, yet the pledges that are being made are not being met? So what would you say to such an African country? So if you met, say, the Minister of Environment, and they ask you, okay, yes, this is good, we want to put policy measures, we want to put institutional measures to prepare ourselves for climate finance, but the pledges have been shortcoming. So should we really focus our effort on doing this? What would you say to such a minister, Okechukwu?
Thank you, Murefu, for that question. And I think this is also linked to the challenges we are talking of. When we look at it from a global angle, I will say that, the fact that Africa lags behind when it comes to financial flows, in general, not even to talk of climate finance, have several implications and reasons. One of them is looking at the, if I can say, revitalizing the global financial architecture, to ensure that we ease the flow of finance to low income and emerging developing economies. And I think that's one of the reasons why, institutions like the Green Climate Fund was set up, and a lot of other funds that are targeting developing or emerging countries. But that being said, at the continental level, yes, access to this finance is difficult. The promises are made and they are not fulfilled at best to the expectations of the continent. And it is more of, if I can call it, a give and take, closer to what Teddy have talked about in regards to, if I have money, that money will be pursuing projects. When you look at it from the angle of public sector, yes, the public sector can do just much to fund these projects, but we know that if we want transformation, the private sector role becomes paramount. And what it means is that at the continental level, while we are looking forward to more transparent, reform or revitalizing of these global financial structures to enable the flow of finance, we should also work on the policies, the capacity to attract this funding. And one of the ways to do this will be to, strengthen the use of the pool of funding that is existing domestically, to use it to attract, or, to use the word leverage other funding that is out there. And what this means is that rather than having this firewall or separation between traditional financing versus climate financing, it makes sense for a government or policymakers to say, if we have this fund, how do we use it to build the right, to develop the right policies the enablers? How do we use it to build the capacity so that we will be able to tap into the additional or the transformative financial capital that we need to reach our goal? Another aspect of this, what we call the innovative financial mechanism, will mean to look closely, contextually, because it is easy to say, yes, what has worked in country A will work in my country. But if you don't contextualize and have ownership to how projects are designed in a way that it achieves its purpose without the unintended results, for example, where most people are left behind or people don't have buy-in, then it makes it easier for us to also come to share some of the best practices where we could use a sort of bottom-up approach to say, yes, the finances are out there, but the way it is structured, the criteria to assess them doesn't fit to the reality on the ground. So from our experience implementing project A, B, C, we do think that some of the criteria or some of the processes should be eased to speak to our realities on the ground. So making sure that we document knowledge, we document experience of countries, sectors that have seen some progress in attracting climate finance could be also another good way to make sure that we ease access to the pool of funds that is out there in the international community.
Thank you. Bianca, I don't know if you have anything to add briefly on this challenge of keeping finance consistent.
Well, it's a difficult one because, like he's saying, we don't have proper systems of tracking. But what I think I would like to add is sort of in relation to what he said about knowledge sharing. And that's where initiatives come in, where you can, because that can help with standardizing different ways of monitoring the financial flows that are moving across the different countries. And I think it's important to have different initiatives themselves that are actually where climate finance is channeled into promoting this policy development or these taxonomies that make it very clear what it is that you're tracking. And then because if you're sharing this knowledge within African countries and then you take it to an international UNFCCC level where you're negotiating, then now at least Africa can make sure they're seeing their realities being reflected. So I think good initiatives, for example, is like with the different alliances out there, like we have the Africa Alliance on Africa Finance Alliance on Climate Change, which is driven by Africa Development Bank. And, they released a report at COP that was actually showing all the developments that were happening with climate risk, because climate risk assessment is definitely growing and it's definitely contributing to adaptation financing that is crucial for Africa, and once you can see how country A has enabled their system, you can see how, does it match with yours? Can you come together and actually say, we see synergies and we think this is how it should be done? So ideally, that aspect of knowledge sharing is what's key to actually getting us on the track of having a standardized way of communicating on these different issues when it comes to the climate finances. But I think, I don't know if maybe I can touch on some of the points that Teddy was talking about, like from before, because something that we've seen with our alliance when, because we're much smaller than the Africa Development Bank, is that you notice with some of these funds, they're quite huge, and some of this financing goes to very large projects, but you do have a lot of medium-sized or small-sized organizations that do need to tap into this climate finance as well, this international climate finance. And what we've seen is that it does help for these international funds to create smaller accessible funds for them that may not need as much finances to develop the proposals, but at the same time can enable small businesses, small CSO organizations to still be accessible to this finance. So that international finance can help the domestic finance to definitely create these smaller products within the country itself to help with this system of the flows coming in. But I think maybe just to also just add, because I saw a question that was coming to me on this pledge, whether it's going to be renegotiated. I think just to reiterate that the pledge was for 2020. So just as work goes on when you go to the COP each year, you do need to think past that because we're already in 2022, and the numbers that you've put across, like for Rwanda, are quite a bit, and that's why it's important to be able to record properly and to track properly, because when someone is putting forward a value of 700 billion per year to 1.3 trillion per year, you need to ask how those numbers are coming, are being put forward. So it's a lot of work, but yes, the pledge is definitely being reassessed. Yeah.
Yes, I saw the question as well. Let me just repeat the question for the sake of those who may not have seen it on the chat box. This is a question that kind of tries to characterize the level of the pledge. So Rwanda targets about 6.8 billion from international sources to achieve 12% of its 38% reduction potential by 2030. So this is one country with the target of 6.8 billion. So Joyce was asking, is 100 billion enough? And Bianca, thanks for touching on that. So just one more question on this discussion around the challenges, and I'd like to go back to Teddy on tracking. So this is around preparation for the global stock trade. This is under the Paris Agreement. In your view, how should African countries think about this process?
Thank you, Mrefu. It's a difficult question, I have to say. So maybe just for the sake of everybody, just in case there's people in the room who might not know of what the global stock take, of the Paris Agreement is. Basically, this is a process, for taking stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And the whole aim is to assess, the world's collective progress, basically. And this basically goes back to the discussions we're having in terms of the pledges that are being made. Here we're looking at the NDCs, that different countries are updating their NDCs and setting ambitious targets. So this global stock take will
I think we've lost Teddy. That's okay. As she reconnects, I'd like to take it back to you, Bianca. So the obvious challenges, of course, the one that we've been talking about is first of all the volume of the pledge, and also the execution of the pledge. But in spite of that, there's still some exciting initiatives that are going on. If you think of green bonds, if you think of initiatives towards green growth. So the question to you is, what are some of the exciting programs and projects that you can mention, of course, in line with Article 2.1c and Article 9 in Africa, that could inspire, the audience, that could inspire the countries, that you could point to and say, look, yes, things are thick and maybe they're not going as well as we thought it would, but look, this is what's happening.
Yes, I do believe it's important to be optimistic in this case. And one of the many places we see it is in the different types of instruments. So you've just mentioned like green bonds. And I think just for the crowd that's here today, to reiterate, there are very many types of instruments. The ones that are very common are like grants, loans, equity, and now also we are seeing new and guarantees. But then we also have green bonds, as Mrefu has mentioned. And it's the good thing with green bonds, just the way the ones that have been issued so far, they tend to have like oversubscription. And for private sector, bonds are usually a low risk, high return type of investment, because you give the money and you get your yield back. You're assured your yield back every couple of months or years. And basically, we're seeing in Africa that we had between 2014 and 2020, we've had over close to $2.8 billion being allocated to green bonds. With Africa Bank, and you're seeing it across different countries. So you're seeing a success. Like it's an instrument that's being taken up. We've seen it in Rwanda, we've seen it in Kenya, we've seen it in Nigeria, we've seen it in Egypt, Seychelles. So there are different countries that are starting to put up this to use this instrument a lot more. And the programs that are around, for example, would be, FSD, which is a Financial Sector Deepening Africa Green Bond Program, and they've been helping, Kenya and Nigeria with their green bond programs on a national level. And it's important because it's helping to establish the regulations and the procedures that are required, which for me, I feel is very, very important to have those policies in place, because it then now creates the enabling environment. And as I mentioned before, I was talking about the alliances. So the one that is looking at insurance, but we're seeing also new funds coming up, like the Into Resilience Solution Fund, which is giving, grant-based insurance products for projects that are looking to, lower emissions. And, it goes as high as giving grants of as 2.5 million euros. So it's quite a bit. So you're seeing more of an uptake of these insurance products because a lot of investors and financial institutions recognize that climate risk is important. And once you consider this in your project design, it gives the investor more confidence so they can actually put their money in it. And I think the other one to consider is carbon pricing, because I work in the space, I have to talk about it. And also because it shouldn't be thought of separately, it should be thought of as contributing to the climate finance in the larger scale with all the other instruments. And for Rwanda, they have, they have participated in carbon markets before through CDM and the voluntary carbon markets. And the NDC is quite clear on using cooperative approaches under Article 6. So these are different areas which can actually lead to more climate finance coming in through attracting private sector investment to the different projects that would be that come out of these different initiatives. So all in all, I think, as Teddy has mentioned, like it's important to have that pipeline, but to also know what instruments that you're going to use for this. And it's really important to take advantage of all these new instruments that are coming up. So whether it's green bonds, whether it's different climate risk insurance products, whether it's carbon pricing, whether it's on a taxation or a carbon markets level, it's up to the country to do that exercise. And you need to actually set aside money to put in these processes. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Bianca, for shining some sunlight on this topic. Let's go back to Teddy. Teddy, you were dropped off, but you were explaining the global stock take. Back to you, Teddy.
Thank you, Mrefus. Apologies, I will not put my camera on. It looks like it's taking a lot of my bandwidth. So I just had a problem with my connection. So as
yes, I think we've lost Teddy again. Sorry, we've lost Teddy again. As we wait for Teddy to reconnect, I see there's a question here on commercial banks in Rwanda. And I don't know if Okechukwu, you're in a position to answer this question. I think Teddy would answer this question, but Okechukwu, there's a question here that asks, are commercial banks in Rwanda already acting upon the shift of finance under 2.1c? Are the main challenges to engage and redirect national commercial capital towards climate objectives? So are commercial banks already acting upon Article 2.1c?
Thank you very much for that question. I will say yes to some extent, based on the fact that for us at the Global Green Growth Institute back in 2017, we did a study to look at the participation of commercial banks, in different countries across the globe, and Rwanda happened to be one of the countries that we looked into. And one of the feedback and also experience we learned from that study was that there is quite a high interest for commercial banks to move from their traditional banking to, invest in green projects, but that the challenge has been that of understanding what this means, for their businesses, understanding it from the aspects of skills to the aspect of the systems and tools that they use as banks. What we've seen since then, increasingly, there has been a lot of move or shift towards some banks, picking this up and even testing the ability to get into the green investment space. And some of the examples I will give will be some of the feedback that we got where some banks will say, we'll be very interested to invest in green projects if we are invited from onset. That is to say, when the project is still at the concept stage, we want to be on the table to understand how the concept is designed. When you move, within the early stage till the project reach to bankability and of course finance, they will be interested. And what it means it will be they should be able to have staff or people who are dedicated to this. And some people are thinking about having a green desk. And what that means is that rather than just placing a proposal that to the bank and requesting for maybe a low interest loan, the bank will be much open to understanding within all these stages of project development how they could make returns on their investment because they are private institutions. So yes, but the volume, or if I should say, the uptake is slow. And I know the reason could be linked to several things, including what has happened in the last 2 years with COVID. But the other aspect of it is, our question of asking how do we even use the pandemic as an opportunity to say if banks are going to be, or if banks are the institutions that governments are used to implement their recovery plans, how do we make sure that these are green? So there are quite a lot of uptakes, and I know different commercial banks are even going towards getting accreditation to be recognized with institutions like the Green Climate Fund. So that's a good step forward. But I think if the question is asked, should we do more or should we expect more from this commercial bank? The answer is absolutely yes, more should be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks, Okechukwu, for that. And we've also seen in other markets, of course, with banks, the question is always, how will this impact my bottom line? Show me how this is impacting my bottom line. Of course, unless it's an issue of compliance. So, for example, we've seen in Kenya, the Central Bank of Kenya coming up with regulations around preparation on climate finance and climate risk integration in banking reporting. So, of course, the banks have to comply. But outside of compliance, like you're saying, the question will always be, what's the bottom line? There's an interesting question here from Richard Vogera, where he says, and I agree with this observation, that, of course, developed countries need an assurance that the funds being directed to developing countries are being used responsibly. But at the same time, the developing countries require some flexibility on how to apply the funds. So going back to the question on ring fencing, or saying this is just climate finance, yet the problem of development is wider and a bit more complex than that. So Richard asks, do we have a consensus here, or how can we think about this tension of developed countries providing finance that's specific to some goals, but developing countries require some flexibility to integrate this with other programs. Bianca, do you have thoughts on this tension, and what are some of your observations?
Okay, I think, yes, I think it also lies with the definition and how will that make it different from development finance or from all these different aspects. So you'll find that when developed countries are also borrowing, they tend to say what they want to use it for. And then, so that's why at least you can get some general mitigation flows, some general adaptation flows here and there. I think the problem is they don't get as much of what they want of a certain thing. So maybe they want more in adaptation, but the money that's available is being allocated to mitigation. So yes, in that particular instance, there is a disconnect because their priority is adaptation funding. Now, the question is, why is there that disconnect? And it's because, like, if you look in the past, mitigation projects tended to be the ones that have a quick ROI, or the loans can be paid back quickly, as opposed to adaptation that relied heavily on grants. So it's still that disconnect between African countries wanting grants, but what's being offered is like concessional loans or this type of instrument. And I think what's happening is now you're seeing a bit more blended finance coming in, you're seeing a bit more guarantees coming in, more grants in different ways coming in, but there's still a disconnect. And at the end of the day, African countries, I could say generally, even when they go to the COP, you'll always hear the statement that adaptation is severely underfunded, and that's what they want financing for. But it's very clear they want grants, not in the form of loans, because we're already indebted in so many different ways. So now it puts another strain on you to pay it back. Then it's affecting the overall, like as it was mentioned in the beginning, the economic growth, the poverty reduction, paying back these loans all the time. So that disconnect is still there, but I have seen that the financial mechanisms such as the GCF have been increasing a lot of their financing towards adaptation, and a lot of it towards Africa as well. So I think there have been improvements, and even at the last COP, they did say now, because we do want more adaptation financing, that we're going to double that amount every year till 2025 in its own. So you're looking at about 40 billion a year until then. But then, and that is a good way of saying that there is some progress. But in terms of flexibility of how to apply the flat funds, it's usually, if they want it for adaptation, then it's very hard to get it in certain circumstances. But it's definitely, there has been some improvement. I think, and if it's in terms of the flexibility, in terms of reporting and things like that, it's important to be transparent about how you're using your money. So I always believe that's important on both sides. If I'm going to lend you money, please, the country is expected to be used properly, follow the make sure that it has no bad environmental impacts, no bad social impacts. So, that tracking and monitoring is really important as well. So you have to have the capacity for that. So in that sense, you can't just be given money without being able to account for it. I think it's important to be transparent about how it's being used. But in terms of adaptation and mitigation, I think there are slight improvements, but there still is a lot more that is needed.
Yeah, thanks, Bianca. Teddy, I see your hand is up. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Let's try this time.
My issues are sorted, but I actually wanted to also just come in on the question raised on how do we maintain the balance, between on one side, African nations or developing countries, making sure that they're utilizing the funds appropriately, but also how do we basically draw this balance? And I just wanted to also share just from experience. Again, I think starting with the African nations, I think we need to have very strong, fiduciary systems. And this is something that my colleague just touched up on: transparency, making sure that we have strong monitoring and evaluation systems, capturing all this knowledge and sharing. So basically, we don't want to come off as, people who are just out there asking for money when we're also not transparent or utilizing it appropriately. So I think that's one homework we need to do on our side. And this is actually informed by the policy frameworks that I talked about, because you also can't talk about all these things if the policy hasn't been set, if the policy has not, prioritize climate change as something important for different sector development. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then second, I think, and someone in the group chat, Alex, just actually touched on what I just wanted to say, is how do we also encourage the different partners, from development partners, to use country systems. How do we make sure that this funding, yes, it's coming to support the climate related stuff, but it also is linked to national priorities. So I think what we do is, just to give an example of Fonera, we have a resource mobilization strategy, but this strategy has also been developed alongside and is informed with all our, the green growth strategy. We look at our national strategy for transformation. So there's nothing that we are mobilizing, or sectors, even our focus sectors, actually in line with national priorities. So I think this is also very important. While we as African nations engage partners, we need to really make sure that whatever funding we're attracting is actually coming in to climate proof or build resilience in different sectors that are over priority. And then when I talked about country system, I think this is something that we also need to think about. I think what makes it easy for Rwanda is having a national fund for environment and climate change, because this also addresses the issue around coordination of climate finance. And I think this is something, I don't know if we touched on it, but it's also very important. How do we make sure that all this climate financing is coordinated, properly? Last but not least, we also need to really think of ways of having direct access. So if we're talking about the Green Climate Fund, how do we make sure that our ministries of environment or our development banks actually are accredited to the, to the Green Climate Fund? Because this also, in one way or another, this is how we build capacities of our local people. And also when you talk about, so for example, if you're mobilizing, it also addresses the need of, some of this money we mobilize, if you're going through another, multilateral or, there's always another layer of fees. And so I think we need to think of ways of how do we make sure that we have direct access using country systems. And but on our side, we need to also make sure that we have the fiduciary systems and the transparency. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Teddy. And thanks, Alex, for that comment as well. Bianca, I'd like to come back to you because the reality is many of the African countries are relatively small, and the African markets are relatively fragmented. If you think of other global funds, like in the past, like if you think of, for example, the Global Environment Facility, which has been around for decades, the GCF provides opportunities for countries to come together and develop larger and chunkier projects, which, of course, if you look at the transaction costs are lower because it's a larger project. When we think of climate finance, are there such initiatives where countries can come together and pull together, or rather characterize their opportunities as one and go for climate finance as a unit? And if no, do you think that there's an opportunity here that African countries should start thinking about?
Yeah, that's of course, when you come together, there's strength in numbers, and then you can definitely mobilize quite a bit with that. So in terms of, at the moment, I think what's happening is you have the MDBs like AFDB, and then it has different funds and then all these different instruments. So it has smaller funds like the Africa Climate Fund, which provides smaller grants. But for Africa as a whole, what I've seen that could be really useful is what happened with the Africa Green Finance Coalition, which is different, basically the different finance ministries in Africa that have been coming together and really want to share the knowledge on what's happening, on what's with their systems, how they've been able to mobilize finance. And initially when it was being started, I think they were highly focused on how they were mobilizing GCF funding. But I think now it's taking a shape where it's looking like we want Africa to come together and be able to have a solid coalition which can actually mobilize more of this financing for different purposes. And this Africa Green Finance Coalition, I think maybe officially launched at COP27, because it's an Africa COP, because it's one of those things to show that we can actually come together and mobilize all this money, all this financing. But I know even at COP26, they had already made some significant progress. They wanted to do a study where they can actually bring together all these successes. I'd say it's sort of similar to what the Africa Alliance did on on the climate risk that is being undertaken in the 10 different countries that they looked at. But this now will look at different systems as a whole. And I think that can be a good opportunity for countries to definitely learn from each other and to mobilize more financing. I think something that also could be interesting would be and to share also, and it's similar to the policy and taxonomy, is the aspect of financial taxonomies, because you're seeing areas where you have where it's very specific. It lists the activities that could be green, and it assesses them with a certain criteria and makes it very easy for you to know what's green and what's not. And if you look at how South Africa are really close to developing theirs, they've borrowed a lot from the EU one as well. So you're having systems where it's becoming more and more important to really identify and narrow down on certain areas which can actually bring in more private sector funding. So that can actually help. But in terms of initiatives, I'd say that coalition, especially because it's government driven, would be a really good example, to definitely follow up on and see if it definitely takes off. Yeah,
thanks, Bianca. Okay, Chukwu, I wonder if you have any other thoughts to add. Bianca has quite comprehensively answered this question, but I'm just wondering, are there other opportunities that you see where African countries can pull together as we think about climate finance?
Well, I think there are quite a lot of opportunities. When we are talking at the regional level, the African Union have their mandate and their vision. And of course, recently we are talking of the African Continental Free Trade area. So all of these are, opportunities to look at huge infrastructure projects that cuts across regions, countries, to look at it from a sustainable green growth angle, rather than looking at those projects, from a national angle. And of course, if you are able to tap into the skills that lies across different countries, then it's easier to have that scale and tap into also private sector financing that are looking for return on investment. So I do see quite a lot of opportunities in sectors like transport, in agriculture, in aviation, in manufacturing. You can name them, in education, health. There are quite a lot of opportunities where projects can be packaged to cut across, sub-regions or the broader continental angle to tap into a larger transformative financing scale for the country.
Excellent. And in the interest of time, I see we have just less than 8 minutes left. There's one question I'd like to ask all of you. So just briefly, you can respond just very briefly. As we think of COP27, so of course, Bianca, mentioned that this is the African COP in Egypt. What should African countries think about and prioritize? And this, of course, is within the climate finance conversation as we look forward to COP27. So I'll start with you, Teddy.
Thanks, Murefu. I think the one thing that I think we should, as African countries really put focus on is pushing for evidence-based, having an evidence-based financial target. So this goes back to the 100 billion that was set up to 2020, which was not achieved. So how do we really push for revising this target and having one that is evidence-based? Thanks.
Bianca?
I'd say it's similar to that, in the sense that we need to be, if we're going to give numbers, because I know that's what has been pushed before, it kind of needs to be backed. But at the same time, I think we should be also looking out for the definitions that will be proposed by the Standing Committee on Climate Finance and see that it actually meets the priorities of the continent. So I think those are two areas we can focus on.
Yeah, thank you. Over to you, Okechukwu.
I do believe that we have a role to play, to show what we could do when it comes to project development. because like we said in the beginning, it's easier to say, give me the money. And on the other side, the financier says, show me the project. So if we can showcase what is happening when it comes to climate or green project development, both at the early stage, the bankable stage, the finance stage, I think there are quite a lot of institutions that have interest at each stage. What it means is that why these projects are ready and could be showcased at the COP, the commensurate policy environment is also backing it up, so that you give the right signal to the global community that we are ready to really be serious about issues related to climate finance flow.
Absolutely. Yes, and I think the consensus here is that on the one hand, as developing countries, and particularly in Africa, yes, there are challenges with climate finance, and there have been shortfalls and shortcomings, but also there are lots of opportunities. And it goes back to what the panelists have been reiterating, the need for better preparation, better understanding, better coordination, pulling together our resources, and presenting bankable propositions, even as we reach out to draw or attract larger volumes of climate finance. So I'd like to start winding down the meeting. It's been a very, very useful conversation. I hope our participants, and I know actually our participants, have benefited. Thank you for the questions in the chat. There are a few more that we shall not be able to cover, but just as a follow-on, we shall share the link to this recording in case you want to replay this or to share it with your colleagues. And as we come to a close, I'd like to invite my colleague June Samo to also just share a few words, and also just to give a vote of thanks, because this webinar has been a joint effort across many institutions and many individuals that you can see here, but also others that you cannot see as we close the session. June, over to you.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm very, very happy that you attended, and thank you so much to the speakers and Refu for that very interesting discussion on this very important topic. We were very excited and happy to work on this as EED Advisory, because it, as Jean Bosco said, it presents a very great step forward for Africa, because these are very key issues. So I just want to give everyone, and just to tell everyone, thank you for taking time to just be with us, ask questions, be curious, because going forward, this is going to become a very pivotal issue. Thank you for taking time to attend, and we hope that you will share this webinar with other people in your organization, so that we can have further conversations and ensure that the continent moves forward in not only accessing climate funding, but also using this funding to ensure that public and private finance is directed towards low carbon development and building resilience. So thank you so much, and have a lovely afternoon, evening, or morning.